You went off to university. You went to Stanford University, which is an incredible university. And you went to ultimately try and pursue product design at Stanford. Why did you choose product design at that stage in your life? What was it that was calling you about that course?
Well, what's really cool about product design is the basic concept is like you don't need to wait around and wait for an idea to fall out of heaven or get struck by lightning. You can systematically create new ideas by listening to people, empathizing with them, and then basically prototyping solutions to the problems that they share with you, and then iterating on those solutions by bringing those solutions back to them and saying, "What do you think? Does this solve your problem?" So for me to be able to combine my love of making things with this process for making things that could be useful to people, making new products, that was really exciting to me. And the product design school was created by a really visionary guy named David Kelly. I had the opportunity to take a class from him, and it was really just an incredible experience.
What is product design for someone like me that has no idea what they teach in such a course? Is it, because my head says like designing like physical products, or?
A lot of the product design school at Stanford is oriented around physical products. Of course, now it's so much more than that. But when I was there at the time, and it was under the mechanical engineering department, it was very oriented around physical products, understanding materials, but all part of this framework of how do we understand the problems that people are facing, how do we empathize with them, and then how do we design solutions that solve those problems.
Did you learn entrepreneurship through this time as well? Because I think in your sophomore year, you took a class on entrepreneurship and venture capital, right?
Yeah, that was really a game changer. So that class called Entrepreneurship and Venture Capital, and the class is a series of case studies basically led by entrepreneurs who come in and present the story of creating their business and lessons learned, and then it's an open Q&A. I got to listen to their amazing stories and ask them questions, and that was super inspiring to me.
Do you remember anything you took away from those classes that ended up being really important for you in terms of an idea or a philosophy or anything?
I think the biggest thing that I took away from my time at Stanford and from that class was the focus on going after really, really big opportunities. And I think one of the things that's so different, growing up here in LA, I think a lot of the business community that I was exposed to is more focused on cash flow, right? Like how quickly can this business turn a profit? How can we do that really predictably? How much cash are we going to generate? At Stanford, the business culture is entirely oriented around, well, how big is that opportunity? Like, is that a huge opportunity? Is that opportunity big enough? Because if you're not going after something that could reach billions of people, that's not that interesting. And that was a totally different way of thinking for me, combined with the venture capital approach, which is really to invest a lot of money early and scale quickly, and then build out the business later after you've achieved scale, after you've achieved mass adoption.
I've always wondered what they teach at Stanford, especially as it relates to business, because the success rate of creating some of the world's sort of preeminent entrepreneurs is really, really high. So you're telling me one of the key ideas is big ambitions.
Yeah, and I think it makes sense because it's so hard to create a business. Your odds of success are so low. So it's really important that you go after something really big so that if you're successful, that at the end of the day, there's a huge opportunity at the end of the rainbow.
So in my head, I go, well, if it's really, really big, then the chance of failure is probably going to go up. So if, I could open a coffee shop, right? And my chance of success is pretty decent. But if I go after building a new social network, which is something only a psychopath would do, then my odds of success are what, 1 in a gazillion?
Yeah, I think what is exciting though about the technology business is the way that it scales. And so I think what's different than your coffee shop example is once you build a great service once we build Snapchat one time, it can scale to 850 million people around the world, right? Whereas you'd have to go build a new coffee shop, on every street corner to scale the business. And so once I think you start seeing the world in terms of the potential to scale and the potential to build, a product or service that can reach billions of people, it really changes, the opportunities you identify or the things that, the services that you want to build.
Interesting. So the question that most of us, especially in the UK, we often don't think about building businesses that have the potential to reach huge scale. In part because we don't have as much of a robust, I think, technical track record in terms of building great unicorn tech companies in Europe as you guys do over here.
One of the, I don't know if we want to go down this path and talk about entrepreneurship in Europe, but I think one of the real challenges in Europe is how small the different markets are in each country. And so I think what's really interesting, when I talk to entrepreneurs in Europe, oftentimes they're very focused on growing first in their country and using that market as a stepping stone. But all the countries in Europe are quite different. They're different cultures and different languages. And so sometimes entrepreneurs can spend too much time trying to grow in Europe, rather than what I've seen out of some companies in Australia, for example. They're on an island. The first thing these entrepreneurs are thinking about is like, how do I go grow in the US? How do I go grow in China? How do I go grow in a really, really big market and get to scale really quickly? And then I can go reinvest and grow in Europe or grow in other countries where it might be more difficult to grow.
That is so true. Thinking about my investment portfolio, there's about 40 different companies there, and almost every single one of them, without really an exception, has adopted the approach of, we'll crack the UK first and then we'll go and figure out the US. But in that transition to the US, they encounter tons of challenges with how expensive it is to succeed here, like marketing costs here. If they're in retail, how difficult it is to get into Target or Walmart here. Also, the founders end up building their lives, their families in the UK, which means that the founders can't really, uproot and move to the US later in the journey. So most of them try the US, waste a ton of money, get burnt, run back. And then I've seen that story play out over and over again. When you think about penetrating these international markets, do you send core team members there?
Oftentimes what we've done with Snapchat is actually follow the growth. So looking for countries where people have already started using the product, already love it, are giving us a bunch of feedback. And then, we'll send folks there, or we'll figure out how to sort of build on the momentum or make sure it's localized properly, make sure we're working with local creators so that the content's relevant. But I think, because our service is based on communication, Snapchat doesn't really work unless you're using it with a friend. You got to use it together. What we look for is just that momentum where friends are using it to communicate with one another, and then figure out how to build on top of that with the content ecosystem or augmented reality and those sorts of things.
What was your first idea that failed?
Oh my! Well, there were. I made an orange juicer at one point, but this. But I think the biggest failure was Future Freshman. Bobby and I was really fortunate to meet Bobby. He lived across the hall from me at our fraternity at Stanford, and we shared this love of making stuff. So we'd kind of worked on a couple social ideas that were interesting, but the one thing we decided to spend a lot of time on was Future Freshman, which was designed to help kids apply to college. It was something that we'd had direct experience with, so we could empathize with how difficult the process is. We had siblings who were also applying to college. So we spent about 18 months building like a full featured website. You could select the schools you wanted to go to. It would aggregate all the essay questions and requirements and make it really easy to apply. But it was very clear by the end of that 18 months or so that it was going to be really difficult for us to win. We were up against a company called Naviance, which had their own software suite, and they had a really good idea, which is they went to all the college counselors around the US, in high schools and things like that, and said, hey, tell everyone to use Naviance. Make sure your students' parents are using our platform. And so they got a lot of distribution through all the different schools. And so obviously you're going to use the platform that's being recommended by your college counselor, not an app made by two kids out of Stanford. Mm-hmm. And so we had a real distribution disadvantage. And then we also realized, like, even if we were wildly successful and we got, the million students, a year who apply to four-year colleges or, something like that, we would have to then reacquire another million students the next year. And so we sort of had this realization that it was going to be really hard to build a big business, and that we really ought to try something different. And most importantly, try to build something that wouldn't take 18 months to build before we got great feedback. So to try to build something really simple, that people could try and that we could collect feedback on faster.